Hello, Anna. How are you?
Hi, very well, thanks. How are you?
No, very well, thank you. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Before we get going, would you like to just give a brief introduction to yourself, a background, so anyone listening or watching has an idea of who you are?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Anna Ploszajski. I'm a materials scientist turned sort of science communicator, really. Throughout my professional life, I've always had these two separate parts. So there's the formal side as a materials scientist. I've done a PhD and postdoc research into materials science. And then while I was doing my PhD, I got really interested in this concept of public engagement and science communication. So alongside all the formal research stuff that I do, I also do communicating of science and materials to public audiences through various media. I've got my own podcast. I do like public talks. I used to do stand-up comedy in pubs when stand-up comedy in pubs was a thing. We're talking during the coronavirus lockdown.
Yep.
For anyone listening in the future. So that the future of that is uncertain. But yeah, I've got these two sides really, doing the material sides and also communicating it to different people.
Amazing. I think you slightly undersold yourself. Anna has also, here we go, was named the Young Engineer of the Year by the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2018. And she won the silver medal from the Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining in, so 2018 was that, 2017 was the Young Engineer. Whilst at Oxford Department of Materials, she won God knows how many prizes for her work and her academic achievements. And the communication has involved publications in The Guardian. You contribute to the Times Higher Education. And I have a few other things down here. Effectively, it's an incredibly impressive CV of science communication and material science. But I'd like to start off with another achievement that you have, which is outside of your research, and we'll sort of tie it back into material science, I think, in quite a neat way, which is that you recently swam the English Channel, which is a huge achievement.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, it was 2 years ago to the very day, we're speaking on the 15th of July, 2 years ago today that I landed in France. Having swum the Channel. So yeah, it's very topical that you should bring it up.
What was your time in the end?
15 hours and 37 minutes.
I like that. Have you got it like tattooed somewhere or like?
It's tattooed into my brain.
Yeah. How far did you, because it's like 22 miles across the Channel in a straight line.
Yeah.
Most swimmers don't go in a straight line. Do you have any idea of how far you actually swam?
Well, I worked it out because I ended up swimming on the strongest spring tide of the year. And for listeners that aren't aware of how tides work, a spring tide is like the biggest movement of water that you can have. And so in the Channel, it sort of sweeps you left and right as you're swimming along, trying to go forwards towards France. And so I worked it out looking at the map later, and I ended up swimming 44.2 miles, I think, in total. Which isn't the same as swimming 44 miles in a swimming pool, because you have got the tides taking you, you're going kind of downstream with the tide, but then it's also taking you left and right and pushing you backwards on occasion. So
no, it's incredible. Like I swim a fair amount, and that's still, I think, very far off in the future. So I saw one of your comedy stand-up sketches, and there was a quote of yours that I absolutely loved. And you were talking about material science engineering and swimwear. And you said that the history of swimwear is a series of really good innovations in materials engineering, but then pulled back 2 steps by the patriarchy every time.
It's true.
Could you tell me what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I was looking specifically at sort of the history and material science of women's swimwear in the UK. Obviously, it's changed around the world quite a lot. But I was really interested in the development of materials and their application in swimwear. And inevitably, when you look at any application of materials, really, they're inextricably linked to society and societal values. And so I found that women's swimwear was actually a really interesting avenue to go down, because, of course, how covered up or not women are is like it's so tied into societal values and societal norms and expectations. censoring, all of that kind of stuff, together with like just the interesting materials engineering that we've managed to do with textiles and particularly swimwear throughout the ages.
Yeah, because in like 2012, the like swimwear from the Olympics was like banned because it was just too good.
That's right. Yeah, the Speedo Fast skin. And yeah, actually, recently I've been getting really into knitting. And when I was researching for that comedy set, I was reading about these Speedo Fast skins, and I found out that what they were trying to do is biomimicry, which is sort of mimicking biology or biological kind of engineering structures, but in like man-made materials.
Yeah.
And with the Speedo Fast skin, they looked at a shark's skin under the microscope, and they saw all these little sort of tooth-like projections, a bit like scales. And they did all their, fluid dynamics and worked out what all of that was about, what the turbulence behind the scales was doing to reduce drag. And they tried to replicate that in a man-made textile. And the way that they did it was by knitting, because in knitting you can create similar type sort of surface textures with the kind of V-shaped stitches that knitting produces. So yeah, I just thought that was a fascinating example of like taking a quite traditional craft and like pulling it into the 21st century by creating these like really highly engineered textiles
to a point that it's like actually considered cheating and they have to change all the rules and so on.
Yeah, the whole punchline to that set was the fact that they banned these materials because they were like so performance enhancing, and so material science is literally better than drugs.
This set is well worth Googling. I think if you just Google Anna's name, it will come up. You go from the Romans right the way through to like literally sewing in lead weights into costumes to stop. Yeah, I mean it's crazy. And I think my favorite bit of it was, we'll move on from this in a second. My favorite bit was that there was a law passed in the war that meant that 10% less material had to be used in women's swimsuits, and so that was when the two-piece was invented.
Yeah, just cut out the fabric from the middle.
Just get rid of it. You don't need it. So talking then of, I guess, the fast skin and like engineering materials is a lovely segue into what your postdoctoral research was, which is on 4D materials. What does that mean? Like, I think a lot of people have heard of 3D printers where they go in and print in 3D, but 4D is a whole nother thing. What does that mean?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, 4D printing involves 3D printing, which most people have heard of, as you say, but 3D printing with smart materials. And I first got interested in smart materials when I was asked to write a book chapter for a popular science book. So here's a really nice tie-in between the two sides of my career, because I was asked to write this popular science chapter, essentially about the future of materials, and it was a really open brief. It went into a compilation book that Jim Al-Khalili was putting together.
Yep.
And he just asked me to write about the future of materials, whatever I wanted. And so I was having a little read around, because obviously that's such a broad ask. And I got really interested in these smart materials. And these are substances that either change color or change shape depending on their natural environment. So a really good example would be a pine cone, because the structure of the pine cone closes up when it gets wet, and it opens out when it is dry, in dry conditions. And so these like simple materials that can swell and shrink depending on environmental conditions can be cleverly engineered by strategies like pine cones, or we can come up with new strategies in the lab with 3D printers to effectively pattern simple smart materials into very clever designs to generate shape-changing objects, or color-changing objects, or materials that will sense the environment and do something useful with that information.
That's cool. So I guess the like mugs that change color when you've got hot water in them.
Exactly.
Are brilliant. Yeah. So what was that book, quickly, just so anyone who's listening can go find it Feel free to plug as much as possible.
The book is called What's Next?
Okay.
And it was edited by Jim Al-Khalili and compiled. And it's basically, I think, 18 different experts all writing about the future of their particular field. So you've got like roboticists in there and like biology people talking about the future of medicine and like space travel, aliens, that kind of stuff.
So this is like future materials, a chapter in there.
Exactly.
Right. That's really cool. So like, I've been trying to think about this concept for the last few days. Like what would make a material? Like why would 3D printing be useful in making a smart material? And the way I'm thinking about it, and I sort of want you to correct this as much as it's untrue, is that you're sort of designing it to be structured on two levels. So it's got its material structure at the base, and then you're also putting a structure in at whatever length scale you're printing at, whether it, whatever like length scale that is, to also have some behavior built into that length scale. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the way I would think about it is like, you can create this smart material in the lab and it might do something really simple like shrink and get bigger again. But that's
with a
not
change
actually
in temperature or
exactly
right.
That's not actually that useful. And if you think about it too much, actually all materials are smart materials because like metals will expand and contract depending on temperature changes. So don't think about it too hard. Otherwise your whole postdoctoral research will come collapsing down around you. However, so you have these materials in your Petri dish and they're shrinking and they're getting bigger, but that's not very interesting. As you say, the reason that 3D printers are useful in this field is that you can program them really easily to pattern in different ways. And the 3D printing technology is very well suited to generating designs, 3D designs on a computer and then fabricating those very easily. And, quickly and in small batches and all that kind of stuff. And 3D printing technology is very well suited to being kind of hacked and personalized as well. So you can use all sorts of different materials with them.
Yeah, no, that's sweet. I know Adidas are looking into doing like a 4D printed sole. I'm not sure if that's the same thing, but doing a custom made midsole of a shoe. It looks like one of those 3D printed structures. When you tell a 3D printer to just print a support structure.
Right. Yeah.
So they're meant to be. Currently, we just have foam in the bottom of our shoes. I think the thinking is that you can custom print a sole for specific applications. So if you wanted more rebound, less rebound, more weight, less weight, wider shoe, thinner shoe, you could then sort of program in, a foam structure. Yeah. So I don't know, it's super exciting, like this idea that we can use 3D printing, because it still feels like quite a young technology. I know that when I was in school, that we were just starting to get 3D printers in schools. Yeah, so to see it be cutting edge research is exciting.
Definitely.
Amazing. So I'm going to move on to a new topic.
Sure.
Your other research topic has been hydrogen and hydrogen hosting materials. So I work in batteries and I get questions all the time at the end of almost every presentation, which is, yeah, that's really interesting. Love batteries. That's cool. But, what about hydrogen? And I sort of say, I don't really work in hydrogen. I don't really know what's happening. So it's clearly something people are interested in, as an alternative to batteries. And as we look to, clear up emissions and so on, I think it seems like cars are basically going down the electric route, even though it looked in the 90s like they might go down the hydrogen route. But there's still big question marks around, I guess, higher energy density things. So planes and ships and so on. What's your sort of thoughts on, I guess, hydrogen as a perspective technology and where it's at?
Yeah, so I did my PhD research on hydrogen and, as I said, did a lot of public engagement around it as well. And through doing those two things, it really revealed the kind of holes in the whole hydrogen plan, because public perception is a real sticking point for hydrogen. Most of the members of the public that I would talk to would have images in their mind either of hydrogen bombs, which are actually based on tritium, not hydrogen, but anyway.
I'm not sure that would help.
Well, yeah, exactly. So either hydrogen bombs or the Hindenburg disaster,
right,
which was, a hydrogen-filled aircraft airship, which like catastrophically exploded.
Whenever I see a photo of that, I always think like, what, like, you see it and you're like, they actually built this. Like people actually thought this was a good idea.
I know. Yeah, it kind of baffles the mind really. But so even now, even with the kind of good PR that hydrogen has been trying to put out over the last few years, public perception about it is pretty negative still. And if you were to go about trying to sell somebody a hydrogen car, that's a huge barrier to have to overcome before, they've even asked you about the performance of it. So that's the first side, is public perception. The second side is the different uses of it. And if we talk about hydrogen-powered cars, I'm very skeptical as to whether they will ever be sort of rolled out at the same scale as like petroleum-powered cars, and also with electric cars, because a hydrogen refueling station costs around $1 million to install. And there are very few of them in the UK. In fact, there's an interesting map online which shows all of the hydrogen refueling stations around the world. Germany's got quite a few. Japan's pretty good. But essentially, if you had a hydrogen-powered car in London and you wanted to get around, you'd be fine. Sorry, did I say in the UK?
You said in London, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So if you had a hydrogen-powered car in the UK, you would be fine driving around London. You'd be fine driving to South Wales,
right? Because
there's a refueling station in Swindon. But
it's about all there is in Swindon.
Yeah. Apart from that, you'd be pretty limited as to where you could go. And so, if you compare that to like battery technology, we have an electricity grid already.
Right.
That isn't a barrier, and so, to me, it just seems that the barrier to entry for hydrogen-powered cars in a widespread way is just far too high compared to other competing technologies. That being said, there are other applications for hydrogen that are very competitive with other green technologies. A good example is buses and forklift trucks.
Right.
Or any kind of portable vehicle or portable object that always returns to the same depot at the end of the day.
Yep.
So you need one refueling station for many miles covered.
That's really interesting, yeah.
And yeah, so there are applications like that hydrogen can contribute to, and there are hydrogen buses driving around London now, and have been for years, perfectly happily and safely, and like in a green way. But with the specific example of cars, yeah, I just don't really see it happening.
It also doesn't really make sense to go from, because you produce a hydrogen by roughly electrolysis, isn't it? You put in electricity and then you turn water into hydrogen. That's probably an oversimplification, but
no, that's pretty accurate.
But that's a step. Yeah. You have to go from electricity, and instead of putting that straight into a car, you then have to go electricity to hydrogen to car.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot of losses during that process, but so hydrogen is a brilliant storage of energy. And it's particularly good for portable applications. So we've been talking about vehicles and stuff because, hydrogen is the most lightweight element that we have. And so it's also incredibly energy dense. So that's what makes it so kind of enticing to engineers and researchers who are looking for this holy grail of like a lightweight
energy
and
density.
Compact energy source. Yeah, exactly. But you mentioned electrolysis there. I think only about 3% of hydrogen is produced in that way by splitting water. Like over 95% is as a
byproduct of,
what's it called? Yeah, like a byproduct of like splitting fossil fuels. So,
right, cracking.
Again, hydrogen. Yeah, it's not as perfect as it might seem on the surface, although it has this really enticing energy density.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I know. I did a presentation quite recently. I'm gonna plug myself for a sec. So I did a presentation quite recently, and in it there was a slide where I was talking about the advent of the electric car and when the electric cars are gonna come online. And there was a slide where I compared the energy density of petrol versus like a lithium-ion battery. And a lithium-ion battery is about 0.9 watt hours per kilogram. And then the equivalent in petrol is 44 And so the difference is huge. And so hydrogen's going to be way higher than that. And it takes energy to move something that's heavy, right? F equals ma. And so the bigger the m, the worse it is. So hydrogen just seems from that perspective to be, I guess, the way to go. But you don't just have hydrogen, right? I think that's perhaps
Yeah, exactly. With hydrogen, you have to consider that it's a gas. And so, yes, you can get really far with a kilogram of hydrogen, but that kilogram of hydrogen is going to be like, it'd take up about 4 meters cubed of a balloon, like towed behind your car to be able to get however far you want to go. So with hydrogen, it's the volumetric energy density that's incredibly low and so incredibly unfavorable. So the hydrogen cars that are on the market store hydrogen as a compressed gas. So they try and squeeze it into gas cylinders as much as they can, which is okay. It's pretty safe technology. Recording back again.
Sorry about that. We had a small technical. We were talking about hydrogen. And so your research, the other thing about hydrogen, I think this is what your research worked on, is that you can store it inside a material, which obviously reduces your. And I guess I'll let you talk about what's the motive for doing that.
Yeah, exactly. So if you can store hydrogen inside solid materials, then the hydrogen density of that material is a lot higher than it would be if it was in like a gas at atmospheric pressure, but also as a gas in a gas cylinder as well.
Oh, it's higher. I thought it was lower. Well, I'd assumed from an outsider that would be lower, but you'd then get better safety. But it's actually higher in size.
No. Yeah. So it's much more dense, like volume-wise, than it is even in a compressed gas cylinder. And also, the cylinders themselves, if you're compressing gas to 700, 800 bar, they have to be really strong and quite thick, and quite like serious gas cylinders to be able to contain that safely. Whereas with a hydrogen storage material, you can hold it in your hand, you can put it in a plastic box, like it's not going to go anywhere, nothing bad's going to happen to it. It just sits there at, atmospheric conditions until you heat it up. And you have to heat the materials that I was working on to about 150 degrees.
Okay, so that's
before they start giving off their hydrogen.
But that sort of engine temperatures, that's not unheard of in engines in cars and so on.
No, not at all. And you can. What we were doing was creating little pellets of these hydrogen storage materials and then very locally heating them using a kind of a control panel, so that it was a really controlled release. So you're actually not even generating that much hydrogen gas
at
any one time. So there's not very much gas to actually ignite if, in a very rare event it did.
Yeah. And is the thinking that so hydrogen like has fuel cells is like one technology, and then combustion is obviously another way. Which way of those do you think it will, if it does go anywhere outside of buses, which are fuel cells currently, which way do you sort of see it going and why?
I mean, I think fuel cell technology is pretty good. The efficiencies on that is fine. With the combustion route, that's quite interesting because you can retrofit hydrogen into a normal like gasoline car to improve its efficiency and to reduce its emissions. So that's one interesting route of hydrogen, is just feeding hydrogen gas into an existing engine in order to improve its like environmental sort of qualities. So there's all sorts of different routes. And this is, I think, one possible handicap of hydrogen, is that there's so many different ways that you can use it. And so, you don't get the economies of scale like you do with like lithium ion batteries, which are like fairly widespread and can be in a car or a phone or a laptop. Standardized, exactly.
Yeah. No, the economies of scale in batteries are ridiculous. It's crazy when you look at the scale and the size. It's crazy. But I think with any, if you're looking at the 90s, people were talking as if hydrogen was definitely going to be the next big thing, right? So it's always difficult to see where things are going to go in a decade or two.
Yeah, that's true. And I think, with the environmental disaster that we have at the moment, like we shouldn't necessarily be putting all our eggs in one basket anyway. No. In reality, it's going to take wind power and tidal power and hydrogen and lithium ion batteries and solar power and all the rest of it.
And nuclear.
To try and, And nuclear, exactly, to try and claw back. Yeah.
If you're talking about bad public perception, there's one for you.
Exactly. So
yeah,
true.
for sure. For sure. And sort of related to that, there was sort of a big, I've noticed you get a little bit angry about this on Twitter, which I think is a perfect reason to talk about it. And I think I feel like I completely agree with you. People got very angry last year about plastic and plastic straws. There was a legislation passed that in Britain, plastic straws are basically outlawed. And so I put up a series of Instagram stories effectively with a plastic. I went to Pret and I got a paper straw in a latte, like an iced latte. And then within about 5 minutes, it would inevitably be sort of not a straw.
Disgusting.
Right. So what are your thoughts on plastic?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. So it was so interesting going through that period. Was it sort of 2018-ish?
I think it was actually last year. When it
was
really,
it more recent
really,
than
really
that?
kicked up. Yeah. I mean, it's been
Blue
growing.
Planet 2. Yeah, for sure. I mean, where I noticed it happening first was David Attenborough and Blue Planet 2.
And the seal.
And yeah.
Or was it a tortoise? There was a tortoise with...
There were all sorts of very sad sea life that had various sort of plastic going on in their stomachs or in their noses or whatever. And it really struck a very populist cause of, plastics are the enemy. We need to start a war on plastics.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, we've already talked about the fact that I'm a swimmer. I'm all for reducing plastic in the environment.
The ocean.
Yeah. But what was so interesting was that never in my relatively short career as a material scientist have I ever seen a material get so much public interest and
hate. It had haters.
Hate and anger around it. Yeah. And it's so interesting because I remember, when I was studying at Oxford, I started in 2009. We studied plastics, obviously, but there was no mention of, biodegradable plastics or plastic waste or any of these kind of issues. And then all of a sudden, that's still pretty recent. And then all of a sudden, there's this war on plastic and it's on the front pages everywhere.
There is now a lecture in that course. The last lecture of that course is now
Really?
recyclability. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So my summarized thoughts on plastics are that they are some of the most incredible substances that we as humans have created. When they were first developed in the 20th century, they were the wonder materials that could do everything that we ever wanted. They were strong, they were durable, they were tough, they were extremely lightweight. You can make them transparent, you can make them colourful. No other material could even come close to what plastics were able to do. Extremely cheap, just
hygienic,
sterilizable,
brilliant for swimwear, very flexible.
Brilliant for swimwear. Yeah. They were incredible. And so as a result of that, during the 20th century, we saw our whole material landscape shift towards using plastics.
There's almost a pre and post. There's almost CE of material science, right?
100%. And, some of the impetus for switching towards plastic was economical because, as you say, they're so cheap to produce. But quite a lot of it actually was performance and aesthetic and fashion. And as I said at the start, you can never divorce material science from and materials choices from the societies that those materials are used in. And so plastics are just incredible materials. What has been their downfall, unfortunately, are all of those incredible materials' properties.
Right.
They're extremely durable. They don't biodegrade. They're extremely cheap, so we make loads of them in a disposable way. They're extremely lightweight, and so they float in the sea. And so we get upset when we see sea turtles put them up their noses.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me, the plastics waste problem, which is, of course, a huge problem. No one's denying
massive issue,
that.
absolutely massive issue.
It's such the tip of the iceberg for me for a much greater problem, which is the fact that pretty much all of our materials are single use. Our mobile phones we use for 2 years and we throw away. There's over 100 different chemical elements in an iPhone. we throw away teapots and like golf clubs, and just because they don't float in the sea, we don't get so upset about that. But actually, it's our society that has created this kind of greed for complicated materials, complicated design, and like a disposable culture. That's the real crux of the problem, I think. And so, yeah, the plastics problem is a brilliant poster child for that. But actually, the problem is far more widespread than just plastic when we talk about materials.
Yeah, and I think I got quite frustrated at the same time by there's some types of interventions that seem sensible but end up having worse consequences than not intervening. And so the classic example is in India, there was some old British white guy who was in charge, who then basically there was a huge adder infestation, and so they put up they said if you can bring a dead adder to us, we'll give you some money. And so all the locals then start breeding adders just to bring adders to then get money. And then they think, this isn't working, let's get rid of this reward. In which case they stopped breeding the adders. The adders then had no value, and they released them. And suddenly I think they something like tripled the number of adders in this small region in a matter of months. It was one of the worst policies ever. But this is, I think, since come to be known as the adder problem. And what I saw with replacing plastic with paper straws was that the amount of energy it takes to make them is massively increased. I'd always take 2 or 3 just because they break. And there was even a case, tragically sad, of a woman who was using a metal straw at her house to drink a G&T, slipped, and then it went up her nose, which is, absolutely tragic. And I'm sure she was trying to be environmentally conscious as she did that. So I think it, as you say, I think it's a choice of material science. Material scientists are trying to choose the best thing for the role, whether that's plastic around your grape packet, or if it's polystyrene in packaging, to do the job.
Exactly right. I think the straws example is really nice because, as you say, people were looking towards different material options for drinking straws. The paper ones were frankly disgusting. And when you throw them away, they're going to biodegrade and give off methane. So that's not ideal. Aluminium straws, incredibly energy intensive to make. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now. But the point is, we shouldn't be trying to replace plastic because, as material scientists, it's our whole job to choose the best material for the job. In every case, plastic is the best material for the job where it's used. If you don't want to use a plastic straw, don't use a straw.
Right.
Like it's a behavioural change that I believe will solve a lot of these problems, and an expectation change, so that we don't expect to throw our clothes away or our iPhones away after 2 years, that we design into them longer use and better recyclability.
Right. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Let's move on from plastic before we blow our brains out. My girlfriend's getting very frustrated for like a year. I kept on just ranting about how plastics were, and plastics are great and brilliant, and so on.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
No, definitely. And actually, there's a really interesting website. I'm not sure if you've heard of Max Rosa. He runs a website called Our World in Data, which is an incredible website. They have a page on plastics. And if I read this ages ago, but a lot of it actually comes from like a very small number of rivers. A high fraction of the world's plastic goes down a few rivers.
Interesting.
And so I see a lot of this is, and then once it gets in the sea, it congregates in very, very high density pockets where like certain swells go. You'll know more about swells in the ocean than I do. But I sort of see that as a quite a solvable problem. You can basically just go scoop it up. It's obviously not that simple. But yeah, I think it's more complex than just get rid of plastic straws. That will solve all the problems.
It's incredibly complex. And this is one of the difficult things.
And fascinating. Like when you actually look at the issue, it's like, there's so much here.
Totally. And this is the difficulty when it becomes, a popular subject to write about in newspapers. You're limited to a headline and 400 words.
Right.
And it's impossible to encompass like the complexity of a problem like plastic waste in that few words. And so inevitably it gets simplified, and so people become polarized to like anti-plastic and pro-plastic, which is
absolutely
very unhelpful.
Talking about trying to communicate science and all in its complexity, a huge amount of what you do is exactly that. It's communicating science. And I think what's fascinating is a lot of what you do is in sort of the medium of stand-up comedy. And so if I was asked, like, could you do a comedy set about material science? I'd be like, no, I can't. What got you into it, and how do you approach it?
So I first got involved in it during my PhD, which I did at UCL. They had a brilliant sort of program for postgraduate students where you could take a course in all sorts of different things, like languages, public speaking, blah, blah, blah. And one of them was public engagement. And I honestly can't tell you why I decided to go to that one. I just thought that it sounded interesting. Yeah. So I went, and it was run by a guy who was head of public engagement at the time called Steve Cross. And Steve was the person that set up 2 comedy nights, one called Bright Club and one called Science Show Off. They do a similar thing, and it's where academics or researchers will do a small 9-minute stand-up comedy set about their work for public audiences. That was the premise of it. Anyway, I'm quite a sort of teacher's pet, I guess.
Right.
I like to contribute in learning environments. And so I took this course anyway, and was quite vocal during the course.
Hands up.
During the day, all the hands up. Yeah. And at the end of the day, Steve came up to me. He's a good friend of mine now.
Right.
Steve came up to me and said, like, "Oh, you seem like you would be like good at doing stand-up comedy about your research." But the terrible side of this is that, like, I was like very, very scared of public speaking, even though I was quite like good at contributing, like in a class environment.
They're completely different, like completely different
I think
skills.
So.
Yeah.
So like, I said yes because I like to please people in authority.
So
Yeah. And then I was like, oh man, now I'm going to have to actually do this. So a few weeks later, I did my first stand-up comedy set, which was about hydrogen storage materials. And it didn't go too badly. I was incredibly terrified of it at the time. But, the audience were very kind. They laughed at some of the bits. And then I was like, okay, that's really interesting, because some of the jokes that I wrote didn't quite work. And I'm not sure why. And some of the things that I said, like, improvised and worked really well. And some of the things that I said, like, they laughed at, but I'm not sure why. Anyway, so there was this like seed of intrigue that was planted in my mind about stand-up comedy. And I think as a person, this is going to sound very, actually quite un-British to say, but like, I tend to be quite good at things that I try.
Right.
Like, that sounds very big-headed. I suppose what I mean is that, like, I'm not very used to failing. I'm not very used to being bad at stuff. And so with stand-up comedy, I was like, I wasn't very good, but I would quite like to be better.
Right. I feel that's something that, we've both been to Oxford. That's something that's very common when people just they're not bad at anything that they really do. And because the moment you're sort of bad at something, you sort of stop. Like, I noticed this in myself. The moment I'm like bad at something, I just like almost immediately decide I don't like it and stop doing it.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a lifetime of doing that. And so, like, I've come to think that I'm good at stuff, but actually what it is that I just don't do the stuff that I'm bad at.
Right.
But stand-up comedy intrigued me to such the extent that I was like, no, I'm gonna keep doing this. I'm interested as to what this is about. So that's what I did. And over the last 6-7 years, I've been doing stand-up comedy about science and being a scientist. And it's taught me just an incredible amount about myself, about science, about how to communicate, how to think about audiences.
It's quite brutal. Like, as in the stand-up comedy is like one of the most brutal ways you can refine. Like when people take an axe and bash it with a stone. I sort of feel that's the equivalent. They're like, you say something that's not funny, people just aren't going to laugh.
It's true. I mean, it's very character building, but it forces you to communicate better, and it's I think I learned such a lot about how to communicate science through doing stand-up. And I think it's definitely really helped me in my career. Like when I wrote my PhD thesis, I was thinking about stand-up comedy as I was doing it, but in the sense that I was thinking of my audience. Like I was thinking of these like tired, jaded professors that were having to read this at like 10 o'clock at night, the night before my Viva. And I tried to make it entertaining for them. No, I did put one joke in, but I didn't put loads of jokes in. But it was trying to make it engaging and readable in a way that I think most people that write kind of, those kinds of
academic writing is very, very dense and
totally.
It's a labour to read.
And I think, we so often fall into the status quo of, I read papers that are this dry, so therefore I'm going to write a really dry paper.
Yep.
And I just thought, well, actually, what happens if I write a literature review that makes characters out of the researchers and brings a bit of drama into the race to find, like this new material that was going to save hydrogen and stuff. And it was more fun for me doing it like that as well.
No, completely. And it's more endurable to read. And I think that I was reading a book quite recently on writing, and it's almost harder to write something with really good clarity. Like it's quite easy to write words around a topic that sort of, they hide your, like a lack of understanding on the writer's part, right? But they sound very intelligent. It's actually really difficult to write clear prose because it actually has to be clear in your head before you write it. And I imagine that comedy is almost a level above that requirement.
It's like the extreme version of that. Yeah, like when you have like 5 minutes to communicate something, you can't beat around the bush. And like when you're trying to get across the concept of a joke, you've got a punchline, like 5 words. You distill and distill and distill in an iterative process, usually when you're writing comedy and performing comedy, until you've got the exact right words in exactly the right order. You say it in the right tone of voice that you know is going to work best. Which is, a brilliant analogy for so many different types of communication, just getting your point across in a clear way.
No, 100%. No, it's super cool. It's super exciting. And you see like comedians literally spending years working on, an hour of stand-up. And it looks it almost looks like they're improvising. And you always get a heckler or whatever in any of these like Netflix specials. And they just have the perfect response. And it always looks spontaneous, but like it's 100% not.
Definitely. Yeah, it's all practice. And I think one of the things that sets professional comedians apart is their ability to make the material that they've been doing for the last 4 years sound as fresh as it does when you listen to them.
I think they're the best presenters. Like of all presenters, I put comedians as, they're dodging laser beams at the same time as, as communicating things that are often quite either complex or like personal.
Yeah.
So would you recommend stand-up comedy to people in science trying to, I guess, get into the, do these forums that you started on, do they still exist or?
Yeah, they do. Actually, Bright Club. So Steve started Bright Club at UCL, but now it's spread to lots of different unis in the UK. They run their own Bright Clubs. Science Show Off is based generally in London, but like sometimes there are some in other cities as well. And so, I definitely recommend. It's, as you say, it's one of the most like terrifying things that you can do, but like it's such a steep learning curve and I got so much out of it and I'm still going now. And actually it changed the trajectory of my career.
Right.
From like doing lab research to being a science communicator.
Awesome. So I'm going to give you like, I guess a minute or two or whatever now, if you want to sort of promote, like what are you up to at the moment? Like what's the plan?
Oh yeah.
I guess it's all gone up in the air with COVID.
Yeah.
But what's the plan? What's the project?
Yeah. Well, so I've just finished writing my first popular science book, which is called Handmade. It's going to be out in spring 2021. So it's a little bit premature to be talking about it now. But it's the thing that I've been most excited about. Like I really enjoy writing. It's probably the thing that I'm most sort of naturally adept to in terms of communication. So over the next year, I'm going to be editing that. I'm also going to be continuing with my own podcast, which is the same name, Handmade. where I'm interviewing craftspeople and artists and makers and materials enthusiasts about the materials that they work with. So the podcast and the book, they both have the same premise, really, which is that a few years ago, I was working in science communication and I was doing science, and I came to realize that actually I know about the theory of materials, and I can draw you as many graphs as you want from memory, and I can work out all the formulas. Oh yeah, like I've got all of that, but I don't actually know, what it's like to forge an iron bar in a furnace, to hit it like a blacksmith would. I don't know how to throw a pot on a potter's wheel. I don't know how to make paper from scratch. All of these different materials, I have no idea about like the hands-on nature of them. And I realized that the people that did know about that were craftspeople and artists and makers and bakers and chocoholics and people that know about materials, but from a totally different aspect to me. So I started the podcast interviewing all these different kinds of people about their favorite materials. And then the book is kind of an extension of that, where I take a different material each chapter and really kind of drill down into the craft history and the material science history, and have a go myself as well.
And draw the parallels of... Yeah, that's super cool. It's such a unique perspective as well. Because, I mean, so we learn about... Take the example of hitting steel. We, I guess to draw every single phase diagram, and you heat it up and then it turns into this structure, and then you cool it really quickly, and then it, can't quite go into the one it wants to. And so it ends up with this type, and that's strained. Yeah. And so it's really hard and so on. But that was all stuff that people knew forging swords, centuries before, without an access to a microscope or so on. It's so cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
yeah, exactly. And, all of our material science knowledge is built on the shoulders of this hands-on experimentation that has been done over like millennia before us. And so, of course, why wouldn't we turn to experts who actually like experience this stuff day to day? Yeah.
Right. No, 100%. And so much of research also is not just sitting down with a whiteboard. Like at least the bits that I really enjoy is being actually in the lab, holding the material. And we've had this lockdown period where, research has been paused, and there's this sort of, well, what can you do? And I sort of feel you can't do that much without actually holding on to the things and testing them and trying them. And, you can go through the theory to a point, but it's only really useful if you've got the physical thing you're trying to look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was sort of the concept behind this podcast. Is a lot of people who work in theory and software get a lot of credit, and it's the people that actually work with atoms and, really get involved with physical stuff. I guess that are underappreciated. Both in craftspeople, but also in the more technical side. So that's really cool. Yeah. No, that's a sweet podcast, and I'm really excited for the book, and I'd love to have you on in spring if you want to do some book promo for that.
Yeah, thanks. That'd be great. Maybe,
read through the book and pick out some interesting bits and go through them.
Yeah.
Amazing. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed it. And I assume that the viewers have too. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's been really great to chat to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Cool. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed it.
No worries.